Jason, thank you very much for joining us. So, as we can see, this has been a new event that has been happening on the U.S. domestic scene. Perhaps you can tell us, with the U.S. elections that are just around the corner, how much of that do you think has affected this most recent development?
So the upcoming elections, of course, do impact everything that's going on, both in the legislature as well as what the White House wishes to achieve. In addition to that, there has been a lot of shifts in U.S. public opinion in terms of Ukraine and other issues, which is affecting how Congress behaves. Now, unfortunately, the continuing resolution that was passed by the House has not yet gone through the Senate and not been signed off by the White House, but it does not include anything for Ukraine or for Israel. Now, keep in mind, the Congress will not meet again until at least November 28th, and there will only be 14 more working days for the rest of this year.
So the number one priority with this vote was to avert government shutdown. So that was the number one priority. And is it correct that there is still a little bit of leeway in terms of securing this funding for Ukraine and Israel?
When the Congress gets back after November 28th, there will be that chance, of course. That being said, it's going to take a lot of negotiations. It seems that most likely the Republicans will tie funding for Ukraine to further support to secure the U.S. southern border with Mexico. That's been a key Republican talking point for a long time, and it's something that they've sought, which the White House has dragged its feet on. So it might be something where they're willing to compromise. The Democrats are much stronger supporters of Ukraine at this point than are the Republicans, and so this would be a trade-off for both of them, but it's something that we hope will be able to get Ukraine some aid before the end of the year.
Okay. And for our viewers, because obviously we have a lot of international viewers and every country has its own governmental structures, would you be able to just give us a little bit of insight into how Congress, the House of Representatives, how they work and how this voting system comes together in terms of what we've just witnessed today?
Sure. Article 1 of the Constitution gives the right to the Congress to organize a lot of things. Specifically, the House of Representatives deals with the budgets. It has the House Appropriations, which looks over total expenditures and what money goes for. Now, Ukraine has been given money or received money due to independent different pieces of legislation that are passed, different appropriations, different bills, for different spending packages, whether it's the purchase of weapons or the financial aid that Ukraine has received or the humanitarian aid. That's all been coming through the Congress. Thus far, it's not had that many problems. But as the Republican support has continued to decline, yet remains very strong for Israel, it seems probable that first a spending bill for Israel will go through the Congress before a spending bill for Ukraine. Of course, we have to wait and see what happens. But given the very limited time before the end of the year, it's key that the Republicans act on this in short order.
And obviously, we now have this meeting between Xi Jinping and Biden. Do you think any of that will perhaps have an effect on where things will go from here onwards in terms of the U.S. stance on the geopolitical position and obviously the stance that the U.S. takes on various very, shall we say, pressing international issues, because obviously tensions are running really high at the moment?
Sure, there's a lot of cooperation with China across the world, and it's not limited to just Taiwan, of course. What's happening in the rest of the Pacific region is key. And what we see is Russia's influence. It's malign also for China. It's not China's interest to have open conflict in a lot of these places. And Russia is something that is continued to create problems, not just for the U.S., not just for Ukraine, but for the world. Given the fact that China does have a close relationship with Russia, there's always hopes that China could be used as an intermediary to pressure Russia towards certain solutions or certain outcomes that would be more favorable to the United States and the West as a whole.
And in terms of Ukraine, at the moment, we know for a fact that the funding that the U.S. has allocated thus far has been huge. And the attitudes towards Ukraine and the amount of aid that is being allocated, the winds are changing. The mood is changing. The enthusiasm is definitely declining. And the funds in terms of the U.S., they're running out. So in terms of even more aid and the fact that, more funds will need to be allocated towards Israel, how much more or how much longer do you think the U.S. can carry on with allocating these billions? Because these are huge amounts of money and the U.S. has its own debt that it has to deal with.
Well, the U.S. does, yes, have about $33 trillion of debt itself. But in addition to that, the U.S.'s need to help Israel is something that negatively impacts Ukraine, as both countries have very similar needs in many things. Now, it's important to note that most of the assistance that Israel needs is not the same weapon systems as the ones that Ukraine needs. So that's a positive. There is enough diversity that it's not all the exact same types of weapon systems. At the same time, the U.S., as it needs to support Ukraine quickly, more than 96% of the assistance the U.S. has allocated for Ukraine has already been spent. So we're getting down to the very bottom of the barrel and need to urgently act if we wish for Ukraine to be able to brace for what could be a Russian offensive this winter.
But there's also the issue of the Indo-Pacific, and we know that Biden is aware of this and that there are some funds that he would like to allocate towards that. So with all this as also a pressing issue, and we know that that is also coming up high on the agenda these days, how much do you think will be able to be divided in terms of that? And also, obviously, this again, we're coming back to the election priorities and the debates that are coming up. How much do you think he will be able to persuade the government to actually keep pushing for Ukraine when we know that there are several other pressing issues on the agenda?
Well, it's going to be much harder. I mean, and I think everybody understands that. Just this week, the chief of the office of the president of Ukraine, Andriy Yermak, was in Washington, D.C. for meetings with the White House, where undoubtedly they discussed this. How much more U.S. assistance can be expected? What would that look like? When that would be sent? And these are very serious discussions, because the fact is, if the U.S. is becoming weak or wobbly in its support of Ukraine due to friction in the Republican-controlled Congress, then Ukraine needs to be fully aware of that. And how they are going to further allocate or receive allocations from the United States and how that impacts battle plans is something that needs to be taken into consideration. But as I said, there is a great deal of hope that before the end of the year, the United States will be able to come through with some new spending package and arms package to support the Ukrainians who are fighting against Russian aggression.
Brilliant. Okay. As ever, thanks very much for your insight, Jason, and I'm sure we'll have you back on TVP World.